The wind carried her voice across the mesa like smoke from a dying fire, weak and desperate against the endless sky. Please, take me far away. The words drifted through the barn door where Jacob Thorne stood frozen, his weathered hands still gripping the feed bucket that had clattered to the dirt floor moments before. 3 days earlier, Jacob had been mending fence when he spotted the wagon overturned in the ravine, wheels still spinning lazy circles in the desert air. No horses. No driver. Just silence and the smell of death baking under the merciless sun. He'd climbed down expecting to find bodies, maybe salvage what he could for the long winter ahead. Instead, he'd found her. She lay beneath a canvas sheet in the wagon bed, so still he thought her dead until her chest rose with the faintest breath. Dark hair spilled across her face like spilled ink, and when he'd lifted her, light as a child, burning with fever, he'd seen the bruises. Purple fingerprints around her throat. A split lip that had bled and dried. Torn fabric that told stories he didn't want to read. Jacob had carried her to his ranch without question, the way a man carries wounded birds. He'd seen enough broken things in his 43 years to know the difference between those worth saving and those already lost. She'd been unconscious for 3 days, murmuring in Spanish and English, sometimes screaming herself awake from dreams that left her eyes wild and unfocused. Now she was asking him to take her away, and Jacob found himself walking toward the barn despite every instinct telling him to saddle his horse and ride in the opposite direction. Trouble followed women like her, beautiful, damaged women who appeared in overturned wagons with no explanation and desperate pleas. He pushed open the barn door. She sat propped against a hay bale, the sheet pulled up to her chin, eyes the color of storm clouds fixed on his face. Up close, he could see she wasn't just injured, she was terrified. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. She shook her head, pressing her lips together until they went white. "It doesn't matter. They'll find me here. They'll kill us both." Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Who will?" She looked toward the horizon, where dust clouds gathered like promises of violence. "They're coming." Jacob studied the woman's face, searching for lies in the tremor of her voice, the way her fingers clutched the sheet. In his experience, trouble came in 2 varieties, the kind you could see riding toward you across open ground, and the kind that arrived wrapped in silk and tears. He'd learned to be wary of both. "What's your name?" he asked, settling onto an appended crate across from her. "Maria." The word came out like a confession. "Maria Delgado." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, like she was testing how it sounded in the air, made him wonder if it was really hers. Jacob had been living alone on this patch of scrubland for 8 years, ever since the Apache took his wife and the bank took his hope. He'd grown accustomed to silence, to the company of cattle and the honest exhaustion of hard work. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Away." Maria's eyes never left the horizon. "Just away." Jacob followed her gaze to the dust clouds, still distant but growing larger. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their quarry couldn't run far. He'd seen that kind of pursuit before, methodical, patient, inevitable. "My husband," Maria whispered, as if reading his thoughts. "And his brothers." The bruises around her throat suddenly made perfect sense. Jacob had known men like that, men who treated women like property, who saw rebellion as something to be beaten out rather than understood. The kind of men who would ride across half of Texas to drag back what they considered theirs. "Why should I get involved?" The question came out harsher than he'd meant, but Jacob had learned the value of brutal honesty. Getting between a man and his wife was a fast way to find yourself on the wrong end of a gun. Maria's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked impossibly young. "Because I'll die if you don't." The simple truth of it hit him like a physical blow. Jacob stood and walked to the barn door, squinting against the afternoon sun. The riders were maybe an hour out, close enough now that he could make out the glint of rifle barrels. Close enough that running wasn't really an option anymore. He turned back to find Maria watching him with the desperate hope of someone who'd run out of choices. Her dark hair had fallen across one eye, and beneath the bruises, he could see the ghost of who she might have been in a different life. "Can you ride?" he asked. Jacob saddled both horses in grim silence while Maria wrapped herself in his spare coat, her movements careful and deliberate like someone afraid of breaking apart. The riders were close enough now that he could hear the distant thunder of hoofbeats, close enough that the dust cloud had resolved into individual figures, 4 men on horseback, rifles gleaming in the dying light. "There's a canyon about 5 miles north," Jacob said, checking his Winchester. "Old mining camp up there. If we can reach it before, no." Maria's voice cut through his planning like a blade. "They'll follow. They'll never stop following." Jacob paused in his preparations, struck by the flat certainty in her tone. "Then what do you suggest?" "You don't understand." Maria moved to the barn door, peering through a gap in the weathered wood. "My husband isn't just cruel. He's connected. Judges, sheriffs, half the cattlemen in 3 counties. He owns them all." The implication settled over Jacob like a shroud. Even if they ran, even if they made it to the next territory, eventually the law would catch up with them. And it would be wearing her husband's badge. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Maria's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, and Jacob saw something flicker across her face, a tenderness mixed with terror that made his chest tighten. "I was pregnant," she whispered. When he found out it might not be his." She didn't need to finish. Jacob could fill in the rest. The rage, the accusations, the violence that had left her broken and bleeding in that overturned wagon. The baby she'd lost because of fists and boots and a man's wounded pride. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Jacob found himself faced with a choice that would define whatever remained of his life. He could saddle his horse and ride away, leave Maria to face whatever justice her husband brought. Live to see another sunrise, tend his cattle, grow old in the quiet solitude he'd built around himself like armor. Or he could stand. Through the barn door, he could see them now, 4 men in black hats, their faces hard as the desert stone. The one in front sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, and Jacob knew instinctively that this was the husband. Rich man by the look of his clothes, soft hands that had never worked an honest day but knew how to hurt. "Jacob." Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you for trying." The riders pulled up in his yard, their horses snorting and stamping. The husband dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of money and education. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jacob stepped out of the barn, his Winchester held loose in his hands but ready. The husband was younger than he'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of soft handsomeness that money could buy. His clothes were tailored, his boots unscuffed, his smile cold as winter ground. "Name's Richard Delgado," the man said, as if offering a gift. "I believe you found my wife." "Found a woman half dead in a wagon," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "Don't know anything about wives." Delgado's smile never wavered, but something ugly flickered behind his eyes. "Now, friend, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. Maria has episodes. Gets confused, runs off, tells stories. She needs medical attention." Behind him, the 3 other men sat their horses like patient vultures. Brothers by the look of them, same cruel mouth, same empty eyes. The kind of men who did whatever Richard told them to do and slept soundly afterward. "She's free to go where she pleases," Jacob said. But you see, that's where you're wrong." Delgado's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his word treated as law. "In the eyes of God and the state of Texas, Maria is my property. My responsibility. And I take care of what's mine." The way he said take care made Jacob's skin crawl. Through the barn door, he could feel Maria listening, could sense her terror like heat from a forge. "She says different," Jacob said. Delgado's mask finally slipped, revealing the monster underneath. "I don't give a damn what she says. Maria is coming home with me, and you're going to step aside like a reasonable man. Or we're going to have a problem." Jacob had been in enough fights to know when words stopped mattering. He could see it in the way Delgado's brothers shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their guns. 4 against 1, and him with nowhere to run even if he'd wanted to. Jacob! Maria's voice came from behind him, soft but carrying clearly across the yard. It's all right. She stepped out of the barn, still wrapped in his coat, her chin raised in defiance that couldn't quite hide her terror. But there was something else in her eyes, a desperate gratitude that nearly broke his heart. "Hello, Richard," she said, and Jacob heard the careful neutrality she'd learned to use as armor. Delgado's face transformed at the sight of her, love and rage and possession warring for control. "Maria, darling, you've caused quite a stir. But it's time to come home now." She walked toward the horses with the measured steps of someone approaching an execution. And Jacob realized that sometimes standing up didn't mean fighting. Sometimes it meant knowing when to offer something more precious than bullets. "Wait!" he called out. Maria stopped walking, her shoulders rigid beneath his coat. Delgado's hand had already moved to his gun, but Jacob wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at her, seeing the resignation in the set of her spine, the way she'd accepted this ending like so many women accepted the fists of angry men. "She's carrying my child," Jacob said, the lie coming as natural as breathing. The words hit the yard like lightning, changing everything in an instant. Delgado's face went white, then red, then something beyond rage. His brother's hands tightened on their reins, sensing violence like animals before a storm. "You're lying," Delgado snarled, but Jacob could hear the uncertainty creeping in. 3 months along," Jacob continued, his voice steady as granite. "Came to me after you beat the last one out of her. Figured she'd have a better chance here." It was a dangerous gamble, but Jacob had spent enough time reading cattle to know men weren't so different. Delgado's type would rather believe his wife was a whore than admit he'd lost control of what he owned. Pride was a funny thing, sometimes it was the only weapon you had. Maria turned to look at him, her eyes wide with something between terror and desperate hope. For a moment, the whole world balanced on the edge of a knife blade. Then Delgado laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Well now. Isn't that something?" He drew his gun with the fluid motion of a man who'd practiced the movement 10,000 times. "Guess I'll just have to kill you both." The shot rang out across the desert, echoing off distant mesas like thunder. Jacob felt the bullet pass close enough to burn, but he was already moving, already firing, muscle memory from a war that had ended 15 years ago but never really left his hands. When the gun smoke cleared, 3 men lay still in the dust. Delgado knelt beside his horse, gutshot and dying, his perfect clothes stained with blood and desert dirt. His eyes found Maria, and Jacob saw the exact moment when love curdled into eternal hatred. "This isn't over," Delgado whispered, blood frothing at his lips. But it was. Jacob buried them in the hard ground behind his barn as the sun set like spilled blood across the sky. Maria stood beside him, no longer carrying his child, real or imagined, but carrying something else now. Freedom, maybe? Or just the terrible weight of what that freedom had cost. They never spoke of leaving again. Some distances couldn't be measured in miles, and sometimes the farthest you could travel was from who you used to be to who you might become. In the evenings, she sat on his porch, watching the horizon where dust clouds no longer gathered. And Jacob learned that salvation sometimes came not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of choosing to stand when the whole world expected you to fall. The wind still carried voices across the mesa, but now they spoke of tomorrow.